Marcus Davis sat on a weathered bench in Riverside Park, where the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the lush greenery surrounding him. He turned a page in the book he was reading, momentarily losing himself in the quiet rustle of leaves and distant laughter of children playing nearby. The park served as one of his favorite places, a small sanctuary in the bustling city where he could clear his mind and escape job demands. Today, however, his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by an unexpected presence across the park that caught his attention without warning. Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the area with sharp eyes, scanning the surroundings, having walked this beat for over 2 decades in total. In his mind, he believed he knew this city better than anyone else, relying on instincts honed over years of service on the streets. When he noticed Marcus sitting alone on the bench, something in his gut stirred. A feeling he had learned to trust throughout his career. A black man sitting alone appeared to calm and to composed, causing suspicion to prickle at the edges of Brian's racing thoughts. "Never seen him around here before," Brian muttered under his breath, stopping to watch Marcus for a moment while trying to place the uneasy feeling. There had been reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Marcus, though it was vague and flimsy at best. But that lead was enough for Brian to act, as he decided to approach the bench with determination building in his steps. Marcus felt the weight of someone's gaze upon him and looked up from his book, noticing Brian standing at a distance staring intently. He recognized the officer's expression all too easily, prejudice masquerading as concern, a suspicion based solely on the color of his skin. But Marcus did not flinch or show fear. Instead, he closed his book slowly, marking the page with a finger, and met Brian's gaze directly. Brian's grip on his baton tightened as he saw Marcus looking at him steadily and unafraid, which unnerved him deeply inside. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Brian muttered quietly, starting to walk towards Marcus with his posture stiffening with each determined step. He disliked how Marcus was looking at him, the calmness and lack of fear making him feel increasingly unsettled and out of control. Marcus watched Brian approach while keeping his expression neutral, knowing exactly what was coming next from past similar experiences. He had seen situations like this many times before, already loaded with tension, and knew his response could determine the outcome. He wasn't in the mood for confrontation today, but he also refused to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation further. "Afternoon," Brian said as he reached the bench, his tone polite on the surface, but carrying an underlying edge of suspicion. "Afternoon," Marcus replied with a calm and even voice, keeping his hands visible and resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face before flicking to the book, fishing for justification. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said simply, noting that it was a nice day. But Brian nodded slowly, without really listening to the answer. Brian was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying, in digging out something from beneath the surface to confirm his gut feeling. "You from around here?" Brian pressed further, and Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes, replying that he'd been around. The non-answer didn't sit well with Brian, who shifted his weight, his stance becoming more confrontational as frustration built inside him. "Mind if I see some ID?" He knew his rights and wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but refusing might escalate matters. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked with a measured tone, meeting Brian's gaze without flinching or showing any sign of intimidation. Brian bristled at the question, irritated by the calmness and refusal to be intimidated, feeling like he was losing control rapidly. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Brian shot back sharply, his hand moving to rest on his holster as a warning. Marcus took a slow breath to stay composed, keeping his expression neutral, though he disliked where this was heading now. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said steadily, questioning if there was a law against that, holding Brian's gaze firmly. Brian's patience was wearing thin, and he snapped that Marcus fit the description of someone they were looking for currently. Though even Brian knew how weak the excuse sounded, he stepped closer, looming over Marcus to assert his authority. "And what description is that?" Marcus asked quietly, refusing to give Brian the reaction he seemed to be seeking desperately. Brian's jaw tightened as he lacked a good answer, but admitting that would mean losing face and control entirely. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped angrily, demanding to see some ID right now, without any further delay. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening between them like a storm about to break loose. Marcus knew he could push back and assert his rights, but doing so might make the situation even more dangerous. He decided to comply for now, reaching into his pocket slowly and deliberately to pull out his wallet carefully. Brian watched every movement closely, his body coiled like a spring, ready to react at the slightest perceived threat. When Marcus handed over his ID, Brian snatched it quickly and glanced at it, though the name meant nothing to him. "Stand up," Brian ordered sternly, stepping back to give Marcus room, while pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus sighed inwardly, but did as told, rising slowly from the bench with hands visible to avoid any misunderstanding. "Turn around," Brian said next, and Marcus felt a surge of frustration but pushed it down to stay calm. He turned around, letting Brian cuff him without resistance, hearing people nearby and feeling their eyes on the scene. As Brian tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this. But his pride wouldn't let him stop now, so he grabbed Marcus's arm and led him towards the patrol car. Marcus didn't say a word as they walked, his mind shifting to what would come next in this unfolding ordeal. He wasn't worried about himself, knowing who he was and that the officer would find out soon enough, eventually. But he felt a deep weariness, an exhaustion beyond this encounter, from being seen as just another black man. As they reached the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside with rough handling. The tension still hung in the air as Marcus settled into the seat, the cold metal cuffs biting into his wrists. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur past in motion, wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong due to unfounded suspicion and bias. The patrol car's engine hummed steadily as Officer Brian Harkins drove Marcus Davis toward the nearby police precinct. Brian's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just transpired in the park. He disliked how Marcus had looked at him back there, calm and unafraid, like he knew something Brian didn't yet. It gnawed at him deeply, making him question his instincts, but pride prevented him from admitting any doubt. Now, Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him as the city streets blurred by outside. His mind wasn't on the passing scenery. Instead, he focused on what would happen next at the precinct. He knew the system well, how quickly things could escalate if he wasn't careful in his responses. But he also knew his own power, the authority from his position that Officer Harkins had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Brian glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror, his voice edged with lingering suspicion. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, unable to let go of his unfounded doubts completely. Marcus met Brian's eyes in the mirror, his expression remaining unreadable, and replied that he had already told him. "I was just reading," he said calmly. But Brian scoffed, refusing to believe it was that simple an explanation. "A guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Brian retorted with disbelief. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly, repeating "a guy like me" with a measured tone that highlighted the implication. Brian hesitated for a moment, realizing the slip in his words. But instead of backing down, he doubled down defensively. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to justify his bias. Marcus didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch, thickening the tension inside the confined patrol car. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool and controlled, asking what someone like him looked like. Officer Brian didn't answer, couldn't answer, knowing what he implied and how it sounded, but unwilling to admit it. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him profoundly. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, and Brian parked near the entrance with an abrupt stop. He got out first, then opened the back door and helped Marcus out, the cuffs still digging into wrists. As they walked toward the building, Brian's thoughts raced, needing to figure out his next move quickly. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect should be scared, compliant, not composed and challenging. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air, with officers filing reports and phones ringing constantly. Brian led Marcus through the main hall, ignoring curious glances from other officers who noticed the scene. He didn't want to explain himself just yet, not until he was sure of his next strategic move. They reached the booking area, and Brian signaled for Marcus to stand by the processing desk immediately. The officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Jenkins, looked up surprised to see Brian's arrival. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking to Marcus, then back to Brian with evident curiosity. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Brian replied, clipped, handing over Marcus's ID without further explanation. He was still unwilling to admit he didn't have a solid reason for the arrest beyond his assumptions. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus, with a flicker of recognition in his eyes briefly. But he quickly masked it, nodding as he began typing into the computer to process the information. Marcus noticed the brief hesitation, filing it away in his mind as a potential advantage later on. The recognition was subtle, but it was there. Someone in this precinct knew exactly who he was. "Captain Bennett's in her office," Jenkins said, handing the ID back to Brian after finishing his entry. "You'll need to take him to her," he added, and Brian stiffened slightly at the mention of her name. Captain Laura Bennett was known for being tough but fair, a stickler for procedure in all matters. Brian hadn't planned on involving her so soon, but he didn't have a choice in the situation now. "All right," Brian said tightly, turning to Marcus and gripping his arm firmly to lead him away. Marcus walked beside Brian, his expression still unreadable, sensing the tension in the officer's body language. As they approached Captain Bennett's office, Marcus noted Brian's uncertainty with a quiet sense of satisfaction inside. Brian knocked on the door, then opened it when he heard Captain Bennett's voice from within the room. The office was neat and organized, with a large desk in the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and non-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork. "Officer Harkins," she said neutrally, as they entered, asking what this was about with a raised eyebrow. Brian stepped forward, guiding Marcus into the room, explaining he caught this guy in the park acting suspicious. "He wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID," Brian added, though his voice sounded less confident now. Captain Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but she quickly masked it, her expression turning professional as she addressed the situation at hand. "Is that so?" she said evenly, and Marcus met her eyes, seeing the recognition there, despite her composure. He knew Captain Bennett was aware of who he was, but she was playing it carefully for now. "That's right," Brian continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Marcus and Bennett in the room. "I brought him in for questioning," he said, but Captain Bennett nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" she asked carefully, studying Brian's reaction closely. Brian hesitated, feeling the ground shift beneath him, repeating that he wouldn't cooperate, though it sounded weaker. Captain Bennett leaned back in her chair, studying Brian carefully before suggesting he step outside for a moment. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument from Brian. Brian blinked, taken aback by the request, but after a moment, he released Marcus and stepped out reluctantly. As soon as he was gone, Captain Bennett's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal toward Marcus Davis. "Mr. Davis," she said calmly, apologizing for this misunderstanding and acknowledging she knew who he was. Marcus allowed a small smile, replying there was no need to apologize, as she was just doing her job. Bennett sighed, glancing at the closed door, explaining she was aware of his identity, but preferred keeping it quiet. "I need to handle this situation carefully," she added, and Marcus nodded, agreeing he wasn't here to cause trouble. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly," he said. "They will be," Bennett assured him, promising to speak with Officer Harkins and deal with it appropriately soon. "But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are from the beginning?" she inquired. Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression, explaining it shouldn't matter who he was in such situations. "My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect," he stated with conviction. Captain Bennett considered his words thoughtfully, then nodded in understanding, agreeing it shouldn't matter, but often does. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air between them. Finally, Captain Bennett stood up, moving to the door to call Officer Harkins back into the office. The confrontation wasn't over yet, but Marcus knew he had the upper hand in this unfolding scenario. As Captain Bennett opened the door, Brian stepped back inside, his expression wary and full of uncertainty. He could sense that something had shifted in the room, but he didn't know what it was exactly. Bennett addressed him, stating, "Mr. Davis here is not the man you were looking for. Release him immediately." Brian blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in, confused and asking what she meant by that. "Release him immediately, officer," Bennett repeated firmly, her voice leaving no room for any further argument. Brian hesitated briefly, then reached for the keys to unlock Marcus's handcuffs with slightly shaking hands. The realization of his mistake was beginning to dawn on him as the cuffs clicked open finally. Marcus rubbed his wrists, giving Brian a measured look and thanking him with an undertone of finality. "You're free to go," Brian muttered, stepping back as the gravity of the situation hit him hard. Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett, saying he'd be in touch, as there was still much to discuss. "I look forward to it, Mr. Davis," Bennett replied, understanding the weight behind his quiet words. With that, Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Brian with a sinking feeling deep in his gut. The confrontation was over for now, but the consequences were only just beginning to unfold for Brian. Brian Harkins sat at his desk in the precinct, tension refusing to dissipate from his weary body. He had barely concentrated since Captain Bennett released Marcus Davis, the unease gnawing deeper with each passing minute. He knew he had made a mistake, but the full extent remained out of reach in his mind. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, allowing his thoughts to spiral uncontrollably. Suddenly, footsteps approaching his desk snapped him out of reverie, and he looked up to see Captain Bennett. "Officer Harkins, my office now," she said firmly, her expression serious and leaving no room for hesitation. Brian's stomach tightened as he stood immediately, suppressing nervousness creeping into his demeanor as he followed her. Each step felt heavier than the last as they entered the office, and she closed the door behind them. She gestured for him to sit, and Brian hesitated before complying, feeling the tension thick in the small room. Captain Bennett moved behind her desk, took a deep breath, and sat down, her sharp eyes fixed on him. "Officer Harkins," she began, measured but stern, asking if he had any idea who Marcus Davis truly was. Brian shook his head in confusion, replying, "No, Captain, just some guy in the park he arrested earlier." Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze unwavering, explaining Marcus Davis isn't just some guy in the park at all. "He's a special agent with the FBI, one of their top agents in fact," she revealed solemnly. The words hit Brian like a physical blow, his eyes widening in shock as implications crashed down upon him. "An FBI agent," he repeated barely above a whisper, the horror of his actions sinking in deeply. "That's right," Bennett confirmed firmly, adding his arrest would have serious consequences for him and the precinct. Brian's mind raced to piece together what this meant, realizing he profiled and arrested an innocent federal agent, based on nothing more than biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake brought a cold, creeping dread inside. "I didn't know, Captain, I didn't know who he was," Brian said shakily, his voice full of regret. "That's the problem, Harkins," Bennett replied sternly, emphasizing it shouldn't have mattered who he was at all. "Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence or probable cause whatsoever. You couldn't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park," she added pointedly. Brian wanted to argue and defend himself, but words wouldn't come. Knowing deep down she was absolutely right, he had let biases guide his actions, and now he faced the consequences of that grave error. "What happens now?" Brian asked lowly, his voice almost resigned to whatever fate awaited him next. Captain Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair, explaining he was placed on temporary leave during the investigation. "I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're not happy to say the least about this incident. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action, including termination." Brian's heart sank at the word termination, hanging like a death sentence over his long career. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and losing his badge was almost too much to bear. But he knew he had no one to blame but himself for this unfortunate turn of events. "I understand, Captain," Brian finally said barely above a whisper, his mind still reeling from the news. Bennett studied him momentarily, her expression softening slightly as she acknowledged this wasn't easy to hear. "I know this isn't easy, Harkins, but you need to understand your actions have consequences for everyone involved. We can't afford officers who let biases dictate decisions," she said, standing up to signal conversation's end. Brian stood as well, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders as he mumbled thanks. As he left the precinct, familiar sights and sounds now felt distant and almost alien to him. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality pressing down like a heavy fog on his mind. He had been a cop so long he didn't know who he was without the badge anymore. The thought of losing it, being branded a failure, terrified him more than he could express. But beneath the fear, there was doubt, confronting that he wasn't the upstanding officer he believed. As he drove home, city streets passing in a blur, he couldn't shake Marcus's calm, unflinching gaze. It had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why Marcus saw right through him. When Brian arrived home, he sat in his car staring at the steering wheel for a long moment. The day's events played over in his mind, each repetition making the weight heavier on his conscience. He didn't know what the future held, but his life had changed irrevocably in one afternoon. With a heavy sigh, Brian got out and walked into his house, silence pressing in on him. He sank into a chair, thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and deep-seated uncertainty about everything. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do next with his life. Brian Harkins stood in the corridor outside the conference room, his heart pounding heavily in his chest. The precinct was quieter than usual, atmosphered heavy with anticipation of what was about to unfold inside. The official review was beginning, and Brian knew every word could determine his career's future path. He glanced at his reflection in the window, looking older and more worn than just days ago. There was stiffness in his posture, tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before this incident. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and forced himself to focus on the task ahead. This was his chance to explain and justify his actions, though he wasn't sure how anymore. The door opened, and Captain Bennett appeared, her expression unreadable as she said they were ready. Brian nodded, swallowing hard as he followed her into the room filled with stern-faced officials. The long table lined with representatives from internal affairs, high-ranking officers, and at the far end, Marcus Davis. Marcus's presence felt like a punch to the gut. Brian hoped he wouldn't have to face him again. But there he was, sitting calmly, eyes focused on Brian, as if studying his every move closely. The look was the same, calm, unflinching, with an edge of quiet authority, making Brian feel small. Captain Bennett took her seat at the head, motioning Brian to sit opposite as he complied. The room was silent, weight of judgment heavy in the air as everyone settled in place. "Officer Harkins," Bennett began formally, explaining this review determined appropriateness of actions during Marcus's arrest. "We will go over events leading up, your conduct, and consequences that followed," she stated clearly. "Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" she asked, and Brian replied yes with a low voice. "Good," Bennett said, nodding, starting with the incident report, where he claimed Marcus matched robbery suspect description. "Is that correct?" she inquired, and Brian nodded, confirming he saw him in park acting suspiciously. What exactly was suspicious about his behavior? Bennett probed neutrally, waiting for his detailed response. Brian hesitated, explaining he was alone sitting there, evasive when asked for ID, seeming to hide something. Evasive how? Bennett pressed further, and Brian said he didn't want to show ID right away. Marcus's voice cut in calmly but firmly, stating he was reading a book, not criminal behavior on the run. Brian flinched at the words but kept focus on Bennett, insisting he was just doing his job, protecting community. "Did you find anything on Mr. Davis indicating criminal activity?" Bennett asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Brian shook his head no, admitting he was clean, as a heavy silence filled the room afterward. One internal affairs officer spoke up sternly, asking if it occurred that Marcus might be telling truth. Brian hesitated, mind racing for words, explaining he followed protocol, trained to be cautious, assuming danger. "But did you consider assumptions influenced by factors other than protocol?" the officer asked pointedly at him. Brian's throat tightened, knowing what they meant, admitting he didn't mean to profile but faltered slightly. Marcus leaned forward, gaze on Brian, reminding his job is to protect and serve, not judge appearance. Brian met Marcus's eyes, feeling defensiveness surged but followed by guilt, knowing he was wrong this time. Captain Bennett cleared her throat, drawing attention back, stating review about mindset leading to actions overall. "We need to ensure every officer upholds fairness and justice. This about integrity of police force," she said. Brian felt sinking in his gut, realizing it wasn't just mistake, but fitness to wear badge questioned. The realization hit hard, struggling to find voice, understanding but words choking in his throat suddenly. Captain Bennett softened, noting we all make mistakes but how we deal defines us as people. "Think carefully about the kind of officer you want to be," she advised him seriously then. Another long pause, weight pressing on room, then Marcus asked to say something with Bennett's permission. Bennett nodded, and Marcus stood, presence commanding attention, looking directly at Brian without unkindness. "I understand police work is difficult, under pressure leading to bad decisions sometimes," he said, steadily. "But we can't allow bad decisions unchecked. This about accountability and preventing it from happening again, he continued. Brian listened, heart heavy, knowing Marcus right, but truth hard to swallow after long career. Marcus added, he's not here to ruin careers but ensure next encounter. Officers think twice before assuming. This opportunity for change, Hope Precinct takes seriously, Marcus concluded, sitting down with gaze on Brian. Captain Bennett nodded thoughtfully, thanking Marcus, noting his words as she addressed Brian again softly. You'll remain on temporary leave while we continue review. Reflect on what's been said today, she instructed. Brian nodded numbly, mind racing as meeting adjourned and officials filed out of the conference room. He remained seated momentarily, thoughts on how wrong he had been despite hoping to defend himself. The realization was cold, hard truth he couldn't escape, standing slowly with heavy movements afterward.